The Joe Rogan Experience.
So actually, there's a set of books that lay this out perfectly. You read Dostoevsky's wrote a book called The Possessed, or The Devils, and it's a description of the initial breakdown of Orthodox Christian society in Russia in the late 1800s, and the rise of radical socialist ideas. So it's sort of like the prodroma to the Russian Revolution. It's a brilliant book, and it concentrates on the personalities that are involved. And then if you read after that, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, where he details what he does in that book is quite remarkable. So he says, look, there were tens of millions of people killed from 1919 to 1959 in the Soviet Union, and as a consequence of internal repression. And it's so dreadful that words can't do it justice. I mean, it's absolutely dreadful what happened in the Soviet Union. I mean, just for starters, 6 million Ukrainians died in the 1930s because of enforced starvation. In fact, in the 1930s, here's how terrible it was. So all the food that the collective farmers, newly collectivized farmers, had produced, which wasn't very much, by the way, was taken from them and brought to the cities. So all the farmers starved to death. Now here's how draconian it got. So let's say you were the mother of some children, and all your grain had been shipped off to the cities, and you thought, well, I'm not going to have my children starve to death. I'm going to go out in the field, and I'm going to, on my hands and knees, and I'm going to pick up the grains that are left over that the harvesters didn't get, and I'm going to feed those to my kids. That was punishable by death. You were supposed to hand in those extra bits of grain so that they could be shipped to the city as well. So that was just the beginning of the fun in the Soviet Union. And what Solzhenitsyn did was say, look, this wasn't a consequence of the Marxist system gone wrong. This was a consequence of the Marxist system. It was an inevitable consequence of the axioms of the Marxist system. And then he lays that out, and it's, well, I think he got it right.
And what is that
why
connection?
he won the Nobel Prize.
But what is the connection?
How much tyranny you have to impose in order to produce something like equality of outcome. And Thomas Sowell's talked about this a little bit too. He said, what the people who are agitating for equality of outcome don't understand is that you have to cede so much power to the authorities, to the government, in order to ensure equality of outcome, that a tyranny is inevitable. And that's right. And the another problem with equality of outcome, this is also a big technical problem, is like, well, what measure of outcome? There's lots of outcomes, like how happy are you? How much pain are you in? How healthy are you? How much money do you have? How much opportunity for movement forward do you have? What's the width of your social connections? Like, what's the quality of your friendships? Do you have exposure to art and literature? Like, you can multiply the number of dimensions of evaluation between people innumerably, right? Because there's all sorts of ways to classify people. You're going to get equality of outcome on every one of those measures? Is like everyone going to have to be equally happy in their relationship? And if not, why not? Why stop with why stop with pay? There's no place to stop. So, and that's a huge technical problem. Because there is no place to stop, there will be no stopping. It's like nobody can have anything else. Nobody can have anything that everyone else doesn't have at the same time. That's the ultimate outcome of equality of outcome. Well, you think about what that would mean. It's terrible. Well, instantly you think, oh, well, there's nothing but a tyrannical system could impose that.
Have you ever debated a Marxist supporter? Have you ever debated someone who is pro-equality of outcome?
No, they don't debate me. Well, the closest thing I think was the debate I did at the University of Toronto about the Bill C-16 issues. But they didn't actually have a debate. They had a forum, which is the postmodern equivalent of a debate. It's supposed to be friendlier, I suppose. But no, I haven't, because people don't do it. They don't ask me to do it.
But what is it about that idea or that ideology about Marxism that's so attractive to young students and to university professors?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it goes back to the issue of inequality. And this is something that has to be dead seriously addressed. It's like, you might say, well, why is the left wing necessary? Let's put it that way. And then a subset of that would be, well, why is the left wing attractive? Well, the left wing is necessary because inequality does spiral out of control. And so there has to be a political voice for the dispossessed. And you don't want people to stack up at zero, where they can't play the game at all. It's a bad idea. Not only do you not, if people stack up at zero, they're too poor to get ahead at all, let's say. They're too poor to open a bank account. They're too poor to buy enough food. Like they're stuck at zero and they can't get out of it. It's a really bad scene because, first of all, that's a lot of suffering, and that's not so good. Second of all, well, at least in principle, a lot of those people might be, might have something to offer the world, or their children might, and you want to open up avenues of opportunity to them so that they can succeed, but so that everyone else can benefit from their success. So, and then the next thing is, well, if the inequality gets out of hand too much, then the whole society starts to destabilize, because if you get enough people stacked up at zero, especially young men, you get enough young men stacked up at zero, they think, oh, to hell with it, we'll just flip the whole board over, and it'll settle in a new configuration, and maybe we won't be stuck at zero in the new configuration. So it foments revolutionary thinking. So there's lots of reasons to be concerned about inequality. And so you need a voice on the left to say, look, we got to parameterize the tendency towards inequality so that it doesn't destabilize the entire society, so that everybody has an opportunity to advance. Like, yes, right, you need that. Okay, so that's the technical reason for the necessity of the left. And then I think it's attractive because young people can be resentful, partly because they're at the bottom of the heap, so to speak. They're not, because they're young. Like, look, you want to be poor in 18, you want to be rich in 80. Which are you going to choose?
Most people's going to take poor at 18.
Well, yeah.
Especially if you've been rich at 80 and you understand you can get back there.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that most of the people who have $1 million or more in the United States are old. Well, why is that? Well, really, do we need an explanation for that? It's like you've had a lot more time to make money. How would that be? That's the explanation. So that's one of the big drivers of inequality. It's just simply age. But it's not obvious that the old rich people have an advantage over the young starting out people. So anyways, but anyhow, maybe you're resentful and irritated because you're young and you're still at the bottom of the heap, and you've got other problems too. It's more difficult for people of your race or ethnicity or gender, or at least you think it is. And so you say, well, I want to make things fair. And then that's also driven by some real compassion, because nobody really likes that, the consequences of radical inequality. Like, nobody likes the fact that homeless people exist and have to go to the emergency ward, to get treated, and they don't have medical coverage, and they have to live in tents on the street. And so if you have some compassion, then you think, well, we got to do more for the poor and dispossessed. It's like, okay, that's an understandable sentiment. But the problem is that it's that desire to help is contaminated by resentment and ideological certainty, and then also by something that George Orwell pointed out so nicely in his book Road to Wigan Pier. It's like the typical middle-class socialist, this was his diagnosis, and he was a socialist, by the way. His diagnosis was the typical middle-class intellectual socialist doesn't like the poor. In fact, they don't want to have anything to do with the poor. They're contemptuous of the poor, but they hate the rich. And I think it's even more devious than that, because I think who they hate are the successful. Some of the successful are rich, but really who they hate is the successful. It's like Cain and Abel. It's the retelling of Cain and Abel. And so there's some positive motivations for being engaged on the left, and there's a lot of negative motivations as well. And the people who are really driven by the radical left ideology, the real radicals, they're almost all driven by resentment and hatred, as far as I'm concerned. Now, let's look at both extremes. So, back to the idea of the ideological and verbal territory. I said with Bill C-16 that I wouldn't speak the language of the radical leftists, because I don't think that language should define the game. But let's say it does. So here's the game. The world is a battleground of groups, and they're battling for power. That's it. That's the game. And some of them win, and they oppress those who don't win. So that's how we're going to view the world. Okay, now the leftists say, okay, well, here's the oppressed people. The oppressors, the patriarchal types, they should be ashamed of themselves and give up some power. And the right-wingers, the radical right-wingers look at that and they say, oh, I see, so the game is ethnic identity, is it? It's identity politics. Okay, we're white males. We're not going to lose. That's the right-wing version of identity politics. It's like, screw you. If we're going to divide into groups, if we're going to divide into tribes, and I'm in my tribe, I'm not going to get all guilty and lose. I'm going to get all cruel and win. And that's like, then you think, well, there's people in the middle. They're kind of looking back and forth. Which side of the identity politics spectrum am I going to fall in? Do I want to go do I want to be driven primarily by compassion, and am I going to accept guilt for my historical privilege? So that's one possibility. And then I'm the oppressor. I'm the member of the oppressor group. Or am I going to say, oh, no, to hell with that. I'm just going to play to win. Well, then I'm going to go to the right. It's like, well, my sense is, how about we don't play either of those games? And the reason we shouldn't play them is, well, the Soviets played the left-wing game and like killed who knows how many tens of millions of people. You can't even count it accurately. The estimates range from 20 to 100 million. Those are pretty big error bars. And the Maoists, maybe 100 million, certainly 60 million. So, okay, that didn't work out so well. And then there's the Nazis, like they played ethnic identity politics and racial superiority. It's like, what, we want to play that game? See, what I've been trying to do, really what I've been trying to do for the last 30 years is say, look, there's heavy temptations to play those sorts of games. But that's not the only game in town. It's a much better game to play individual. It's like, get your act together. Stand up in the world. Make something of yourself. Stay away from the ideological oversimplifications. Set your house in order. That's rule 6 in this book. So I have a book rule in there that says, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And it's a very dark chapter about the motivations of the Columbine High School killers and this other guy named Carl Panzram, who was a serial rapist and arsonist and murderer. And he wrote an autobiography, and the Columbine kids also wrote about why they did what they did. They're resentful to the core, bitter, resentful, terrible. And, well, I'm suggesting that people stay away from that resentfulness and bitterness, even though life is hard and there's malevolence in the world. It's like, yeah, you can tell a story where everyone's a victim, because we all die, we all get sick, you know, and things happen to us that are bitter and terrible. Betrayal, deceit, lies, like people hurt us on purpose, you know. So it's not just the tragedy of life, it's malevolence as well. It's everyone's a victim. You can tell that story. The problem is, if you tell that story and you start to act it out, you make all of that worse. That's the problem. And it's so, this is why partly I got attracted to Christian imagery, at least in part. Because there's an idea in Christianity that you should pick up your goddamn cross and like walk up the hill. And that's dramatically, that's correct. That's the right answer. It's like, you've got a heavy load of suffering to bear, and a fair bit of it's going to be unjust. So what are you going to do about it? Accept it voluntarily and try to transform as a consequence. That's the right answer. It's the right answer. Because the rest of it is tribalism. And we're too technologically powerful to get all tribal again.